Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week we'll be discussing some innovative ideas for stage arrangements in a COVID world, then we'll have another edition of our concert club, and finally we'll talk about a famous YouTuber's quest to take up the trombone. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Tiffany, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Classical Chronology. Okay, here's how this works. I'm going to play clips of 3 pieces from different points in music history that share a common feature. My co-hosts don't know what any of the pieces are, but it's their job to put them in chronological order just by listening to them. This week, the 3 pieces are united by the fact that they all use prepared piano.
Oh.
Well, that I presume early bounds this to about the year 1900, but maybe there are some maybe people were preparing pianos before that. Should we talk a little bit about what preparing a piano is?
Yeah, I mean, we should review that interview that we did with Aerosols, where she was talking to us about how she was preparing her pianos. But usually, generally speaking, prepared pianos are prepared by inserting certain screws, pieces of wood, rubber,
felt, even pencils. I mean, people put all sorts of stuff. But yeah, so that basically there is some foreign object inserted between the strings of the piano, so that when the hammers of the piano hit the strings, you get added, usually percussive sounds, or else maybe it modifies the sound of the piano itself so that it sounds, like a hammered dulcimer or a tack piano or something like that.
Yeah, there is a purist approach to the prepared piano in which some people say, technically a prepared piano is something where there are objects that are inserted that are foreign to the piano's body, inside the strings in some way, that whatever alteration that you make to the sound is fully reversible, and that when you put in the objects, the string's original pitches are altered kind of fundamentally so that they're not, like, the original pitches are not necessarily discernible. So that's kind of a very purist. Of course, I broadened that definition slightly for this game. All right, here we go. Excerpt number 1. Excerpt number 2. Excerpt number 3.
I can see like the various techniques used in each of the excerpts. So the first one is very much like gamelan-like in terms of sound. Mm-hmm. The second one had the most like, I don't know if you can use a better word than just like boinks, like it was the most like boinky of the 3. Also very like serialist, perhaps. Like there's a definitely like a little seed that kept repeating.
Almost minimalist, you might say.
Minimalist, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
And then the last one was probably the most like traditional, if I can even say that, of prepared piano, where they're using what I think is what Tiffany referred to as kind of the real pure way of kind of understanding prepared piano, with the using the harmonics of the strings. So it almost sounds like a harp than a percussion instrument, let's say.
Yeah, I agree with your characterization of the sound world. And so now the question is to put them in order.
Yeah.
My thinking was that the last one, it not only had this most, purest form of the prepared piano, but it also relied on sort of Eastern sounding modes. Like it sounded like the purpose of the preparation was to make it sound like an authentic instrument, maybe from Turkey, Mesopotamia, sort of the Ottoman Empire world.
Sure, yeah.
And that made me think that maybe this was music of Fazil Say, who does do some preparation of the piano, or maybe somebody like Reza Vali, who is an Iranian composer. They're both quite contemporary. So even though in a way that had the most sort of ancient world sound to it,
Right.
I would actually think that one is the most up to date in terms of what composers are using the prepared piano for today. So that was the one that I was leaning towards an answer like that's probably, from the past, 10 or 15 years.
That's interesting, because I went like the very like...
You went the opposite?
Well, only in that I just kind of took it as face value. Like, this is simpler. Like, less boinks, probably earlier, but...
Yeah, but I think
like your
prepared,
reasoning on this.
I think the prepared piano, like the point was the boinks early on. Like that's
right,
what
like
the composers.
It's a new toy. Let's like figure out like all of its kind of bells and whistles, and then kind of chill it out afterwards. Yeah,
right.
I think that's probably the trajectory that we're looking at here.
Yeah, I mean, the first one, the one, and I agree with you. It had that kind of Indonesian, Javanese, or Balinese gamelan sound. So then it's like, who would be doing that? I mean, the name that comes up immediately is Colin McPhee, although I know that there are some other Dutch composers and actually some Indonesian composers who prepared pianos in this regard to make this kind of a sound. So, but is that the earliest?
Well, if we're going to go with your reasoning,
yeah,
right, and we're going to go extremely logically, then I would put the boinks, the second excerpt, first.
Right.
As being the earliest,
right.
Then to the gamelan, then to this more recent utilization of the prepared piano. Like that progression, if we're going to go by that pseudoscience that we're going by here, then that's probably the reasoning, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the second one I thought could maybe have been John Cage. I mean, it even had like a little bit of Steve Reich kind of a sound, or maybe who is that weirdo who lived in the cave? Terry Riley. It could be like a Terry Riley.
I think you've referred to Terry Riley in an equally weird way before on the podcast.
It's like
the weirdo that lives in a cave is a new one, I think.
Bit of like grad school lore that I picked up that he lived in a cave in California for a number of years, and it may or may not be true. I think
the last time you described him as someone that dropped like a lot of acid.
Well, that's
right.
That is 100% true. There's no question about that. Kensho, I agree with your interpretation of my quote unquote logic. I'm going to go with you 2-1-3.
2-1-3 is I think what we were locking in here. We're either right or completely opposite. Let's see.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll start by saying that I was hoping with these three excerpts to sort of give a little bit of a window into what it's like relatively short, at least compared to, most of the things we discuss on this podcast are history. And so chronologically, the first excerpt that occurs in this set of three is actually the last one, which is a piece by Henry Cowell written in 1930 called Sinister Resonance.
Henry Cowell, I needed to mention that name was on the tip of my tongue and I just didn't get it.
Yeah. And so, what's kind of fascinating is that we think about John Cage as the kind of father of the prepared piano. I mean, he wrote like this entire oeuvre of prepared piano sonatas, which, by the way, is the source for the second chronological excerpt, which was also the second excerpt that I played for you today. That was his sonata number 5. And that's prepared in a different way, which I'll talk about in just a second. The last one, which of course was the first excerpt that I played for you today, is a piece by Kelly Moran, who is a living artist and composer and prepared piano artist, we'll say. And it was a piece called Lemonium, and that was released in 2017.
Well, so we were off, but I did say that the number 2 is John Cage. So
you can take that as a win. And all the things that you were observing were correct. What probably I think is an interesting piece of information is that the cowl, the final excerpt that I played, the pace was a lot slower because the piano wasn't technically prepared. The player was reaching inside the piano and stopping the strings with his hands. And often when you run into cowl works, it might be surprising how early they come, given that they generally predate, John Cage by, in this case, a number of decades. So I think this is maybe before they had thought of, okay, let's put foreign objects in. You know, I'm stopping it with my hands, and therefore it takes a longer time to execute these kinds of things.
And that is what Fazil Say does, is he does the hand inside. So I'm so used to hearing that because he's one of my favorite artists.
I see.
So that threw me off there.
Yeah. And one of the more seminal works as like kind of a precursor of the prepared piano is Henry Cowell's Aeolian Harp, where he reaches in and strums the instruments, and then there's also, I think, Banshee, which has a similar feel because he slides his hands up and down the strings, which is a very creepy kind of timbre. But anyway, all those things predate John Cage by a number of years, and then you have John Cage with what we think of as the more traditional prepared piano, more boinks, as you say, he's going all out, doing all the weird techniques, thinking all the things in, and then Kelly Moran, who is one of the more interesting artists out there today dealing with prepared piano, and is, I think, emblematic of a certain trend where like prepared piano becomes more a landscape of the electronic/pop music scene. And she's one such artist. I mean, she has released what kind of read as classical albums, but I would think of her more as a crossover artist. So this is a kind of, I mean, in this case, it's purely acoustic piano with screws in it, but she has some other quite interesting electronic hybrids as well.
Very cool.
So 3, 2, 1.
3, 2, 1. All right.
I just learned a lot about prepared piano.
Yeah, seriously.
I did last night as well.
This is really cool.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds. So we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have for us?
As classical institutions prepare for a return to regular concertizing next month, their goal, naturally, is to fulfill their mission while maximizing the safety of their performers and their patrons. But what if this safety came at the expense of musical comfort or tradition? This is the question posed by a study carried out by researchers at the University of Utah Department of Chemical Engineering this past summer. Titled Mitigation Strategies for Airborne Disease Transmission in Orchestras Using Computational Fluid Dynamics, the paper modeled the aerosol transmission of orchestral players seated on a stage. And I should mention that the visualizations, which can be seen in a New York Times write-up about the study, are truly terrifying. The main takeaway of this study is that instruments that produce the most aerosols and droplets, the trumpet, bass trombone, and oboe, should be placed closest to windows, doors, and HVAC air capture systems, and instruments that have no discernible aerosol transmission, such as percussion and string, should be placed in the center. So, is it worth performing an orchestral concert with snare drums and xylophones taking center stage, or is that a fate too horrific to contemplate?
Well, first of all, the study is very interesting, and yes, the whatever, this kind of simulation of where the air goes and like these clouds that just stay and accumulate over the people is just like, I don't think I want to ever breathe in a concert hall ever again.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, but wouldn't this also depend on every single hall being very different?
Absolutely. And how many halls actually have, exits to the outside? From the wings. I mean, some of them do, some of them don't. But some of them, the wing space is very far away, like the actual external exits. So, but I think that there are some other strategies. Like you could put HEPA filters, around the side so that you're then trying to capture as much of like the trumpet aerosol diffusion right where it is.
Right. I've heard of like placing filters above everyone's seat, because the aerosols do go up as you can see in the
right.
fluid dynamic.
Like if you've ever been to a casino, where they allow smoking and they have those negative airflow filtration, so that you can smoke and you don't even smell the guy smoking who's sitting next to you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, it shows how much I've stepped foot in a casino.
Well, they're really disgusting. Yeah, I've only been in a casino once or twice, mainly just to use the bathroom. But it is amazing how you see people smoking. And of course, that's one of the things that they say about COVID transmission is like, if you could smell somebody smoking, then you could be infected with their aerosols.
And by the same token, they say, normally you'd want the smokers to sit next to the window. So, I mean, this makes sense in a kind of basic way. I think the main thing about reading this article that I took a little bit of issue with was the general portrayal. And it starts from the melodrama of this diagram that you have, where, in a normal orchestra configuration, we're all just bathing in each other's aerosols. That's not really how this works. In fact, most of the science that's been returned about, transmission or dispersion of aerosols, in fact, implies that in general, playing instruments causes no more aerosols than talking, normal talking, not even loud talking, normal talking. And that's because, and I'm going to seriously take issue with their opening scientist quote here, which says, "Wind instruments are like machines to aerosolize respiratory droplets." Okay. They are not machines to aerosolize respiratory droplets. They are machines for dispersing sound. Okay, machines have a purpose. You design them for a certain goal, and that's what they do very well. It is not that trumpets are sucking in aerosols and spraying them out everywhere, all over your orchestra. That's not how this works. So it's just a little bit of hyperbolic pop science kind of spin on a lot of this that makes me kind of roll my eyes, particularly as, we're now getting back to school and trying to figure out how to make college orchestras work. And at first we were dealing with a situation where university administrations all over the country are handing down these campus mask mandates. You have to have the mask mandate where you can't hold classes in person. And they want you to hold classes in person because everybody's vaccinated now, hooray. But you can't play a instrument in general with a mask over your face. Now, we have talked about, and this is mentioned at the very bottom of this article, performance masks, which are by far the more practical solution to this, actually.
These are like bell covers, right? And
bell covers, and then also masks that are double layered in such a way that allow you to pull aside the two layers and, connect with the mouthpiece of your instrument, and there's a different design for flute ones. But in general,
it's the big bag that goes around the whole flute, right?
No, that's the clarinet. The flute ones have aperture that's on the side of the mask rather than
I see.
in the front, because that's how you play the flute. Yeah. The clarinet is the one with the big bag. And there's also particular mouthpieces that have been innovated with the flute that allow you to connect with a mask that is in front of your mouth rather than, aiming to the side. Anyway, I digress. This is by far the more practical of the two.
Rather than reseating everybody.
And the other thing about this is, and now I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but the other thing about this is the article makes big bones of the fact that this is not the conventional way we do things. We haven't changed this in decades. Okay. Please look at orchestral seating charts and stage platforms throughout history. It's changed a lot, okay? We're not so ossified in tradition that we're gonna, clutch our pearls over, a little bit of reseating. Now, that said, in a situation that describes a lot of academic context, you're dealing with quite a lot of changes in general. And so to add another change like this as sort of let's see an experiment with how it works, when you have no guarantee that it actually helps, frankly, is a little bit, I don't know. It all reads as pop science to me in a way that kind of just rubs me the wrong way.
Well, I'll say a couple things about this. One is that it might surprise people, the science that has gone into actually studying aerosol transmission from wind players when they use these bell covers and masks. You just look at it, and sometimes people think, well, the aerosol doesn't come out of the end of the bell, and the masks, they're still blowing into the thing. Actually, the masks and the bell covers have been proven to really reduce aerosol transmission. So I agree, that is a much more practical solution. The second thing I'll mention is that, of course, I have this foot very much in the choral world, and that's sort of a scary thing for a lot of people, but it has been shown that choral music can also be very safely conducted.
I mean, here's the thing. It's completely possible to sing with a mask on.
Yeah, exactly. It's very possible to sing with a mask on.
It's actually much more possible than it is to play a trumpet with a mask
That's
on.
right. That's exactly right. And for about 10 months during this past COVID period, I'm a staff singer at a choir here in Seattle, and we were singing in masks for that whole time. It's not fun, but it's better than nothing. But I will link in our show notes to a Facebook post from the head of the Brigham Young University Chorus talking about how they were able to succeed as well as they did carrying out choir rehearsals during the COVID period. But finally, I did want to pick up on something, Tiffany, that you said about the fact that, the orchestra setup is not like hundreds of years old. It's maybe 100 years old. And to just do a little digression about some historical seatings, like, I don't know, Kensho, you conduct a lot of orchestras. Do they all have the same seating, or no? There's still like some variation that goes on, right?
Absolutely. And, of course, if you travel to different countries, they have different traditions. Also, the hall that they're in may require a certain seating or whatever. So I find that it's changing not just from orchestra to orchestra, but even week to week in an orchestra. I remember in Philadelphia when I was assisting, depending on the piece, the timpani might be center in the back of the hall or off to the side, or we were always playing around with what sounds better. Even we've come to the conclusion that at least in that hall, in the Kimmel Center, Verizon Hall, that it sounds better with the stage extension out all the time, no matter what. So there's a little bit of flooring in front of the violins and stuff like that. So not even just seating, but also the design of the halls, now that you have these kind of hydraulic lifts, that can kind of change levels on the stages, the canopy, that is kind of the acoustic ceiling of the hall, that can also be adjusted. So there's so much more possibility with these new halls where you can kind of play around with this. Now, does that mean we should be putting the percussion in the middle of the hall and, shoving all the winds to the sides? Maybe not, but it definitely is something where I think people are constantly trying to change the setup of the orchestra to their advantage based on what home court is.
It's one thing to talk about the varying little, split violins or, vagaries that we have in our lives as orchestral conductors, but a very living part of our population that deals with this on a much more varied basis that is still alive today is anyone who conducts regularly in a pit.
Oh, yeah,
because
sure.
Pits are weirdly designed. They're not generally acoustically perfect. There's all sorts of problems. Let's even just take the singular issue of never being able to hear the first violins because they're playing into a wall. Yeah. And so, I mean, any number of workarounds for this, including putting the first violins like straight down the center in front of the conductor all the time. And frankly, I mean, I'm looking at a page right now that is on a really interesting blog, and one of the posts is titled 18 Orchestra Seating Plans from the 19th Century. We'll link it in the show notes, and I'll link you guys here right now. But there's really interesting normal orchestral things here. There's a number of pit setups, and obviously those are kind of horizontally elongated, but even in the normal orchestral, it's like sort of, where do you put the brass in relation to the winds? Do you split the winds around the brass or vice versa? There's both of those present in this page, and then depending on the shallowness of your stage, how close does the percussion actually get to the conductor? I mean, this is not entirely without precedent.
And what I'm looking at here, too, I see in some of these diagrams is something that I know from my reading of Berlioz that was very common in the 19th century, is that in almost all of these, the chorus is in front of the orchestra. And with my organization, that's something that we are considering, too.
Oh, cool.
So that our chorus is going to be in masks, at least for the first couple months. But yeah, that's something that people don't realize. And, what always happens when we do choral orchestral works, it's like, orchestra, you have to be quiet, or we can't hear the chorus, right? So it's like that. It's so obvious, and it sort of makes me wonder why we don't do it that way anymore. Although it's more visually.
There's an interesting one about halfway down this page where the chorus is flanking the orchestra.
I see
it's
that.
the Darmstadt Musikfest from 1844, and the orchestra is kind of compressed into this very narrow and extremely deep setup that kind of goes straight back from the director, and then the choir is flanking them on either side. So that could be an interesting. And frankly, I mean, if we're going to go by COVID models, this looks the most COVID safe if you're going to have an choral orchestral.
That's very true. That's very true. Oh, Tiffany, this is a great resource. Thanks. I would really encourage all of our listeners to follow this link in the show notes. This is really fun to look at what's going on here. And it's once again, it's a great point that this is not the first time that people have been experimenting, although I don't think any of these experiments put the snare drum and the xylophone in squarely in the middle of the orchestra. Well, very interesting, a little historical digression there, and of course a very contemporary issue, but listeners, if you have any thoughts about any of this, let us know. And with that, on to our second topic, Kensho.
Listeners, it's been a while since we had a Gabfest concert club, and so we're very excited to bring this segment back with a special performance of George Friedrich Handel's outdoor Baroque court music, the water music suites, and the music for the royal fireworks. The performance we watched is by Hervé Nicquet and the Concert Spirituel at the Festival de Chambord in 2016. We'll put the YouTube link down in the show notes, but for now, let's hear a clip. Will, you brought this to our attention. You've been talking about wanting to do Concert Club with this particular performance for a long time now. So why don't you give us a little bit of what got you excited about this performance?
I love everything about this. I just find this so entertaining. First of all, I love the music. I mean, the water music was one of my very first musical passions. Probably my first, actually. My mom had it on a tape, and so that was like one of the few, pieces of classical music that I had real access to, like when I was 11 or 12 years old. And I used to listen to it over and over and over again. We played it in my middle school orchestra, so I think that's how I got into it. So I do love the water music suites in particular. This particular concert, though, I mean, look, it's got this amazing backdrop of this beautiful French chateau and all of these, like, perfectly manicured gardens. There are these amazing drone shots over, the whole landscape. And, like, there's people outside having picnics, and they've, like, constructed this huge stage. But what's really fun about this is that, Le Concert Spirituel is a historically informed practice ensemble. So, they do music of the Baroque era primarily, and they use original instruments or reconstructed instruments. They use all of this performance practice, quote unquote, stuff, to make the music more authentic in its performance. And the thing about this music that Handel wrote for the outdoor court, like the water music, which was played on a barge floating down the Thames in, 1725 or something, is that it's written for huge forces. So, I mean, like royal fireworks music, I mean, if you just look at the score, it says like 20 bassoons and, like 19 oboes or something like that. And they really do a lot of that here. I mean, I don't know. It looked like there were a good 10 oboes here. And the fact that there are 10 Baroque oboes playing at the same time, it's like so many of the normal criteria that we would judge a performance by are just like out the window. It's like, okay, is it in tune? Of course not. Of course it's not in tune. It's
Who cares?
Baroque oboes. It's 1,000
Right.
recorders, right? I mean, it's just like, it just recalibrates our sense of the things that we often listen for. And to me, it's just very fun and joyous and so different, so that's why I was very enthusiastic about this for the past few weeks. But what did you guys think? Did you enjoy it as much as I did?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. I think it's hard to enjoy anything quite as much as you enjoyed this performance. But with that caveat, I did enjoy this, and I did think to myself, this is the way to experience this music.
Right.
It was, written for large outdoor, frankly, galas on barges and what have you, in this way that was not meant to maybe demand your entire attention to all the minutiae of artistic integrity and performance practice and these kinds of things. Like, that's not what this music was written for, even though that's the ethos it often inspires in us today.
Right.
And so this was a kind of refreshing way to experience this, because I will admit, I mean, I turned it on, I watched it for about 20 minutes, and then I started puttering around my house doing various things, and then I came back, and then, eventually the fireworks started happening, and we have to talk about the fireworks because that was awesome and also a little hilarious. I've played 1812 in a situation where there were cannons, like in a stadium, like actual cannons, and like it was terrifying. But anyway, I digress. The point is, I enjoyed doing this because I felt like it gave me a little bit of the spirit of what it was to be able to experience that music in the spirit that it was meant.
It's so funny. I know I'm so struck by how extra this performance is.
So extra.
And every time I have this discussion about like someone that's like, dare I say, like someone that's like amazed by a Bruckner symphony or like a Mahler symphony with like, 1,000 people on stage or whatever. And it's so awesome. It's so extra, man. I think this is actually way more like rock and roll, like just so extra and awesome, such a great display of what humans can do. I don't know. I'm always so struck by like this kind of historically informed performance where there's this many people. And also you said that this concert, first was on a barge. Mind you, it was 2 barges, right? It was like one for King George and his party people, right? And then there's a separate barge just for the musicians, like floating alongside of it, performing along the way with no mics or anything.
Right.
Will, like my first entry into this music was probably playing a lot of wedding gigs. And so I was playing like the string quartet version of the water music. And I thought, this shit is so boring. Like, what is this? Like, why does anybody want this music to be on their wedding, which is a whole other segment that we already covered already. And then I realized, the story behind just the fact that, King George asked for this water music to be played on this party down the river because he was trying to upstage his own son, who was at that point like a big playboy and like, kind of attracting a lot of attention to himself. So he was, King George had to be like, well, no, I'm the king here, and like created this thing. Of course, then his son becomes the second King George II.
Right.
And of course, not to be outdone by his father, commissions Handel for the fireworks music, right? So there's always like these 2 pieces are kind of commissioned, almost to upstage one another. And so of course, like if there was one big barge with, 100 musicians playing this stuff, of course the next one is going to have fireworks, involved. And apparently, there's like a soldier got his hand blown off during the first performance of this. I think it was like inclement weather where there was a lot of misfires. Like the whole thing was just a freaking mess. But I love that about all of this. And almost perhaps like this performance, the fireworks music is almost too like perfect. I kind of wanted like the stage to catch on fire or like a stray firework like go into the crowd just to like really relive the moment of like how it was back then. But nonetheless, this is such a cool performance.
And I think that we have to talk about Hervé Nicquet for a second, the conductor of this, who is dressed, he's got like this brocade tunic, looks like Littlefinger from Game of Thrones, basically.
I was thinking like Mephistopheles or something.
He looks like Nosferatu, and conducting like a psychopath. I mean, he is just up there like full-throttled, full-body conducting with no, like not a glimmer of a smile, like no joy on his face, even though he's doing this most joyous music. I mean, he is just up there like a madman. And then you've got like, one of my favorite things is when there's like 12 horns playing, these natural horns. First of all, everybody's natural horn looks totally different because there were not standardization. So you've got some with like very like extensive loop-de-loops throughout the tubing, and then you've got some that are just really huge, big, circles and stuff. And you got 10 or 12 horns playing these trills, like, and everybody's probably, wagging their lips at a little bit different rate. It is just wild.
It's thrilling music, right? And also I just want to learn how to play the trumpet, these historically informed trumpets with the hand on the hip,
hand.
And just
the pose was epic.
The Sass
so cool.
Masters.
Yeah, I love it.
Yes.
I love it.
Oh my God, it's amazing.
there's just so much attitude and like just raw energy that I think music that comes later, I don't know, whatever it is about how we learn to play that music, we just lose that completely. And so anytime I see a Baroque ensemble or historically informed practice ensemble, this is what I come for, is seeing the energy on stage this way. So this is I'm all about this.
But Tiff, we'll talk about the fireworks.
Well, I mean, I was, thinking, okay, like, when are they going to do this thing if they're going to do it? And on the video, I don't know how loud it is in person, but on the video, it kind of comes across as these, like, pops. Like, they sound like poppers almost, and they're roughly set to landmark points in the music in a way that, is choreographic. And I'm thinking, okay, that sounds like a pretty tasteful way to incorporate fireworks into what can be, like, fireworks are distracting.
Yeah.
And then it gets so loud. I mean,
raucous.
I know that if I was going to be in that orchestra, I'd be like, oh, wow, that wasn't an enormous downbeat from the timpani. Oops.
Yeah.
you know?
The thing that I kept wondering about is I wonder if this was like a historically informed fireworks presentation.
Did someone lose a hand? Because otherwise it wasn't.
Well, I mean, but it just seemed like maybe somewhere in between. Like they were availing themselves of certain technologies that I doubt they would have had back in the 18th century. But, they didn't go as far as to like do some of those very extravagant displays that you see in modern fireworks that were like they do these like shapes.
Right, but these were also triggered by a button. I don't think
they must have been triggered by a button.
Somebody wasn't like running around trying to set these on.
But it did make me wonder. Like I wonder if anybody does do historical fireworks. I mean, that would be super interesting to know about, and then to maybe actually pair with something like this.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like modern tastes are so. There's such a high expectation for these kind of very vivid technological.
Yeah, the more chaos, the better for something like this. I swear, it's just I'm here for the chaos.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if historical just meant that it ran off at random times, because you never know when those kinds of things were going to work or when they weren't going to work, which is probably why somebody lost a hand. Yeah. So I'm guessing this wasn't historically informed because it was quite well matched, I would say. This is the only time in which I will agree to hear that many recorders at once.
That's right. Yeah. At one point, all the oboes they change over to recorders, which was a very common practice at the time. It was like you played woodwinds. It's like Broadway doublers these days.
But Baroque recorder is super awesome. Like virtuosic recorder playing. This is nothing compared to what we talked about.
1,000 recorders in an auditorium.
Oh boy, that was a year ago.
Yeah,
never again. Well, listeners, this is one you should not miss. Please click the link in the show notes. I'm very glad you brought this to our attention and insisted that we do this for Concert Club because I enjoyed this very much. Next, Tiffany, what do you have for us?
At the end of June, YouTube phenoms, the Try Guys, released a video of one of their own, Keith Habersberger, entitled Keith Learns Trombone in 30 Days. At the beginning of the video, Keith, who is an amateur French horn player, professes his goal to learn to play all of the instruments in a high school band and states that, in this case, he's going to give a recital on the trombone to his office in 30 days' time. The rest of the video chronicles his journey from learning what the 7 trombone positions are, suffering a debilitating lip fatigue as he scales back his ambitions and changes his repertoire choice, to giving an accompanied mini recital to his friends and colleagues in his office featuring a piece that he calls Serenade Through the Leaves, which is actually Schubert's famous Serenade D889. Let's hear a clip.
I'm sort of giving myself the task of learning the trombone in 30 days. My ultimate goal is to learn every instrument that would be in a high school band. There's something about playing an instrument that is really, really challenging. It's very expressive. And I've always wanted to play the trombone. The trombone is the coolest brass. It's so dope. There's like cool like swing bands. You get to go, And it's the only brass that I can't just pick up and play. All brass valves, they're like the same. There's 3 buttons, you push the buttons in the same combination, for the most part you get the same results. For a trombone, it's got no valves. I have no idea how to play that thing. So I am going to get myself a trombone, find myself somebody to teach me how to play. Hopefully at the end of it, I will be able to play a standard classical piece that a high schooler who plays trombone might play at a real recital. And I'm gonna do it at a recital here.
My name is Chris.
This internet contribution fits into a larger and perhaps slightly clickbaity trend of people learning difficult skills under time pressures more extreme than those we typically subject ourselves to in real life. For example, the now 6 years old video by Violin Newbie showing her progress learning to play the violin over 2 years with a pace of improvement that I think could be considered rather quick. Or Karen Cheng's video, I Learned to Dance in 1 year. And those are just the videos that I'm aware of that fall into this category. So we thought we'd talk about the general phenomenon of such transformation videos, particularly as they relate to learning musical instruments. To start with, Kensho, Will, what are your first impressions of the premise of the Try Guys video?
Well, if I saw somebody say that they were going to learn the trombone from scratch in 30 days, I would not be expecting much. But then you start this video and you find out right away that Keith played French horn in high school, and I guess maybe even continues to play it a little bit.
I think he revives it in support of his YouTube career because I mean, if you haven't heard of the Try Guys, they're people who they started out at BuzzFeed with the premise of the Try Guys try stuff, and they were kind of everything wild under the sun. The Try Guys try, wearing pregnancy bellies for a week. The Try Guys try all sorts of crazy food. They've always been about seeking out weird experiences to just attempt. And with the attitude of, if you don't try, then you're never going to find out what it's like. And so they throw their whole back into it. And then they were eventually able to go independent, which they did a couple of years ago, and have since continued to grow their brand and branch out into things that actually I think they care about more personally. So at BuzzFeed, they had pressures of, doing things that were clickbaity and would cater to that demographic of the internet. But since then, they've all kind of taken on personal things of their own. And actually, I was listening to their most recent podcast, I think, in which Keith says, well, you guys have mechanical keyboards and other weird hobbies. I have musical instruments. I'm going to collect all the musical instruments. I'm going to learn all of them. So this is something that I think he cares about. And I was touched at the end of the video when he wraps it up. I mean, of course, most of the video is comedy, but he wraps it up with a message about parents and music education and teachers and kids. Try this thing, because if you don't try, and boy, don't we know that musical instruments require a whole lot of trying and looking like a damn fool for a long time before anything fruitful comes out of it. Anyway, that's my saw. But, the premise of Keith tries to learn trombone in 30 days, I don't know. It is clickbait, but also, I don't know. Kensho, what do you think of the journey?
I was pleasantly surprised. I think I heard from you, Tiffany, that Keith had played French horn, so I kind of knew, okay, so it's 30 days, but he knows how to buzz, and he can kind of figure out there's some equivalencies there between trombone and French horn. What I like, there's one part where he says, when he's considering changing the repertoire to something easier, and he says something about how it's a performance, and a performance is where you show how far you've come and not how much more you have to go, right? And I thought it was actually boy, I would love to say that to a lot of people.
Yes.
But we had a discussion within ourselves about kind of bad representation of classical music or classical music performances, like the Miss America competition or the America's Got Talent stuff, and how people try to make what we do as classical musicians almost trivial or easy to do. So in a way, when you say, I'm going to learn the trombone in 30 days, that's kind of the message that I was expecting to receive from Keith. Yet he refers to so many times about how difficult this is, and he had to really actually work at it every day for a very long time, right? To the point where his lips gave out. And that's also a concern that I don't think people really think about, especially with instruments like the trombone or the trumpet or these brass instruments or the French horn, where people are like, oh, it's all you do is like blow in a metal tube, like it's so
fatigue
easy.
is so real.
And fatigue is super real. And I love the fact that he talked about it, and the fact that you can actually injure yourself doing that too. So in a way, it was a very kind of real experience of watching someone try to play an instrument. I kind of said like, oh, could I learn how to play the cello in like 30 days?
I did the same thing.
Right? Because that's kind of like would be the equivalent thing. And I was like, oh, like, yeah, I would probably have a very similar experience trying to learn how to play cello after playing the violin and the viola, right? So I don't know. I totally related to this video, and I'm not a big like Try Guys fan, so it's not like I think I came in with a very open mind about this, and I liked it. It was cool.
I found it totally heartwarming, and for the same reasons that you guys point out. And I think that there are a lot of really positive elements of this video. So one is, you click on the title and you think like, oh, well, this guy is just going to start, like sliding up and down, from zilch, and he's just going to figure it out on his own. But no, he finds a teacher, some guy who does internet videos about trombone. He goes to a music store, like to a
local
physical
music store.
Local music
I loved
store.
it.
Gets beginning band books that he remembers from his, 4th or 5th grade thing. I mean, you see that he's working on fundamentals like long tones, the correct position. He's playing with a tuner, all very good, very like, fundies focused learning techniques. And the teacher, says like, well, if you want to be a high school level trombonist, you should learn to play the Ferdinand David trombone concerto, because that's like, the big recital piece that all high school trombonists do.
What did you guys think when you saw that music? Did you think he was going to be able to do it? I was like, there is no way. Like that should look
When I
hard.
saw the tenor clef, I was like, this guy's not going to be able to do it.
Well, and that teacher, I don't think was aware at that time that he suggested that piece of the timeline that Keith was trying to work with.
Right.
So
right.
Keith set out to say, I'm performing a recital in 30 days time, but I don't think he said the 30 days time to his teacher.
Yeah.
And so, 1 week before his scheduled performance date, he's like, oh shoot, I really can't, I really cannot play this.
Right.
And actually, this is an interesting, a lot of their videos follow this kind of arc where they attempt to do something a little crazy, and I get the feeling of that in some of their videos, they kind of have to invent a road bump to give it the little dramatic flair that they want, so that their triumph can be all the more real. I don't think Keith had to invent this one.
Yeah, right.
I think he really was feeling, I mean, they paint it comedically, but I think he really was feeling as low as he is in that video. It was like, my lips literally cannot handle this.
Right, but that's the other thing that's very healthy about this, is that he realizes, because as you guys said, this is really real. These are muscles that you're using in your lip embouchure, and people can really do damage. They can hurt themselves. And so the fact that he does pull back on his ambition for the piece that he's going to do is so healthy and good. I mean, it's like there's so much internet stuff out there from dudes who are doing these challenges, and it's all about the machismo and the pushing through. Yep. And here with these guys, it's not about pushing through. It's about recalibrating what the success looks like. And that's very much what he does here. And then at the end, just the recital, oh my gosh.
It's so cute.
He wears his suit. He looks very nice. He's got a suit and tie on. I love it. And he gives a really nice performance of this.
It actually sounds quite good, right?
Yeah.
It actually sounds really that's a nice tone that I'd be happy to hear, in most of the groups that I've conducted.
The one gripe I had was a comment by one of the audience members, because we need to dispel this idea there's spit in people's instruments.
Yes.
And I was just like, no, it's not spit. It's condensation.
Well, they say it's condensation, but some of it is spit.
I mean, yeah, there's a little bit.
It's condensed spit, so
Anyway, learn to do something. Don't be afraid of doing it, even if you're an adult.
Right.
Know that it's going to be not as good for a long time. And even if it stays not as good as you think, I mean, not everything that you do has to be a career pursuit, least of all musical instruments. I mean, the reason I contextualize this video in the broader trend of like amateurs doing is because it does share something with those other videos that I named, which is that just try, like, just do it with like a whole heart and a lack of self-consciousness. Because one thing that I think the other videos that I named has a little bit more of, maybe even than Keith's, is that like they're really public about their learning process. Like the girl who learns how to dance in a year is dancing at bus stops. She's dancing in the grocery store line. People are like, what are you doing? And obviously like an instrument is less of an ideal thing to do that with, but still the idea is you try and do it everywhere. The girl who learns the violin in a year is playing in literally every room in her house, in every house that she lives in, at every time of the day. Just do it a lot, and do it without self-consciousness. That's what I got. And I think that like the Try Guys have a huge audience, and I think that they're using it for good, generally speaking.
So I mentioned cello, but are there other instruments that you guys are like kind of thinking about trying to do something like this, where you try to learn an instrument in a number of days?
Well, the cello is the only one I think I could feasibly do in this kind of compressed amount of time. But like, I don't know, maybe I'll get. I mean, through circumstances which I won't bother to go into on this podcast, I do have a French horn like downstairs right now in my house. So like,
Well, Tiff, you learned the make at home hurdy-gurdy in fewer than 30 days.
I'm not sure I became proficient on that. But...
Oh, I beg to differ.
Willies?
Yeah, I would pick something totally weird, like the hurdy-gurdy. Or actually, I have an accordion that somebody recently gave me, and it's in my guest room right now. And yeah, that would be what I would pick. What's yours going to be, Kensho? Cello?
Well, cello, but no, there's no way I can carry around a cello to make sure I can practice.
Yeah, it's got to be something convenient.
Think of something more portable.
Baroque recorder.
Baroque recorder, I could do that. Yeah,
actually, that would not be a bad idea, the Baroque recorder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, guys. See you in a year.
All right, very good. Well, that wraps up our final segment for today, but before we go, let's go to our classical mixtape. Will.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Kensho, what do you have this week?
So I'm bringing a piece and a performance of this particular piece that kind of serves two fronts. First, Michael Morgan, a conductor, just recently passed away, and so I wanted to bring something that one of his performances. And internally, the three of us were discussing some repertoire choices that I could make for a concert. And I think one of you suggested this piece, Missy Mazzoli's Sinfonia. I guess the full title is Sinfonia for Orbiting Spheres, written in 2013. And so when I was looking through performances or recordings of this, I found one by Michael Morgan and the Stony Brook Symphony Orchestra.
Well, a very interesting piece that you've brought us here, Kensho, Sinfonia for Orbiting Spheres. And yeah, a great tribute to Michael Morgan, who we sadly lost at the age of 63 this past week. So thank you for that, Kensho. Tiffany, what do you have this week?
Well, in my prepared piano exploits, I came across a performer-composer named Volker Bertelmann, or his stage name is Hauschka. And he has a couple of albums, and he's one of these people that I think falls into this kind of crossover territory of people who currently work with prepared pianos. But this is a cool improvisation that he did at NPR as promotion for one of his recently released albums called Foreign Landscapes. And I just thought it was really fun. You can see inside the piano he's got sleigh bells and ping pong balls and, 2 rolls of duct tape and all these kinds of interesting things. But I do recommend watching the video of this in addition to listening to it. But listening to it is very cool as well.
he has got a lot going on in there.
And he somehow makes it sound electronic. Like, it makes it sound like there's a loop pedal in there. It's not. It's just him and a piano.
You know how I was first introduced to Hauschka? I mean, apparently he's like a big famous, crossover artist. But I first heard of him from Hilary Hahn. She has an album where she collaborates with him. But this, from what I just heard, this is cooler than the album they did together. Well, thank you, Tiffany. A great selection here. And thanks again for that game about prepared piano. I learned a lot from that today. For my suggestion today, I am following up on, I guess it was last week's episode or 2 weeks episode. I don't know. I'm so lost track of where we are in our episodes. But the last time that we played Name That Tune, one of our submitters submitted a piece by Arvo Pärt. I was just reminded of how much Arvo Pärt used to be like one of my very favorite composer. I mean, like when I was in college, I used to listen to Arvo Pärt constantly. And it just seemed like a great excuse to reconnect with some of his music. So one of the pieces that I really loved by him is his Berliner Messe, his Berlin Mass. And I wanted to bring the Credo movement from that. I just think it is so beautiful. This recording is not the one that I used to listen to all the time. This is a more recent recording by the Chor des Bayerischen Rundfunks and the Münchner Rundfunkorchester, conducted by Peter Dijkstra. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.